Over 2,000 years ago, on a mountain in central China, a prince obsessed with living forever was mixing soybeans with the same minerals ancient Chinese alchemists used to search for eternal life. He wasn't trying to make food. He was trying to become a god. His alchemists ground the beans. They boiled them into a hot white milk. Then someone, nobody knows who, dropped in a pinch of mineral salt. The milk changed. It thickened. It turned to soft, pale curds. The prince stared at it. He'd failed to make an immortality elixir, but he'd just accidentally invented a food that would feed more than 1 billion people, cross oceans, survive dynasties, and outlast every empire that tried to claim it. That prince died 2,100 years ago. Almost nothing he built still exists. His palace is dust. His kingdom is gone. His name barely survives. But the food from that failed experiment? You can buy it today, 5 minutes from where you're sitting. This is the history of tofu. And it starts with a blind monk who crossed a killer sea, an American founding father who wrote about it in secret, and a broke California couple whose book turned it into a supermarket industry overnight. The prince's name was Liu An. He was born in 179 BC. He ruled a wealthy kingdom in what's now Anhui province. His scholars produced the Huainanzi, one of the most important philosophical texts in Chinese history. But Liu An didn't care much for ruling. He cared about 2 things: books and immortality. He funded alchemists. He built laboratories on Bagong Mountain. He hunted for something that had haunted emperors for centuries: the elixir of life. According to legend, that hunt is what created tofu. His alchemists were grinding soybeans, boiling the slurry into milk, and they added a mineral, most likely gypsum or brine, hoping it would trigger some kind of magical reaction. It did trigger a reaction, just not the one they wanted. The soy milk curdled, proteins bound together, water separated out, and what remained was a soft, white, jelly-like block. They tasted it. It was mild. It was filling. And it was good. That's the legend. But there's a problem with this perfect origin story. The earliest written version of it appeared almost 1,000 years after Liu An died. Think about that gap. 1,000 years. It's the equivalent of someone writing today that a medieval French king invented pasta. You'd want more than one document. For centuries, historians dismissed the whole story as a folktale, a myth attached to a famous name. There was no evidence Liu An had anything to do with tofu. Then, in 1959, archaeologists opened a tomb. The tomb was in Henan province. Inside, carved directly into the stone wall, was a mural. And that mural appeared to show, step by step, in careful sequence, the process of making tofu. Grinding beans, boiling milk, adding a coagulant, pressing curds, draining water. Every stage was there. The tomb dated to around the 2nd century AD. That's roughly 200 years after Liu An died. Not proof he invented tofu, but hard physical proof that within a century or 2 of his lifetime, someone in China was making it, and considered the process important enough to carve into the wall of a tomb for eternity. Dr. Huang Xingzong of the U.S. National Science Foundation studied the mural closely. He concluded it was the earliest documented tofu workshop on Earth. So did Liu An invent tofu? Maybe not personally. Maybe it was one of his alchemists. Maybe it was a nameless cook in a kitchen we'll never find. Maybe it emerged gradually, in different places, and Liu An got the credit centuries later because he was famous. We may never know. But here's what the tomb tells us for certain. Somewhere in Han Dynasty China, someone dropped a mineral into hot soybean milk. And instead of dying of poisoning or throwing the ruined batch away, they tasted it. That one taste was going to change everything, because within a few hundred years, tofu wouldn't just be a curiosity in one kingdom's kitchen. An entire empire was going to be forced to eat it, and the reason has almost nothing to do with taste. Here's something most people get wrong about ancient China. Meat was rare. Imagine a farming family in the Han Dynasty. A husband, a wife, 3 children, grandparents in the same house. They might slaughter a pig once a year. For New Year. Maybe for a wedding. The rest of the year, grain, vegetables, whatever they could grow or forage. Livestock cost money they didn't have. Grain fed to animals was grain not fed to children. They needed protein from somewhere else. The soybean had been growing in China for thousands of years. But raw soybeans have a serious problem. They're hard to digest. Eat them wrong and they'll make you sick. Boiling helps, fermenting helps more, but nothing solved the problem completely until tofu. Because tofu did something remarkable. It concentrated the protein, it stripped away the digestive trouble, and it produced a food that was cheap, filling, and could be sliced or crumbled into almost anything. One farmer with a bag of soybeans could feed his family for weeks. That was reason enough for tofu to spread. But there was another force behind it, a force that came from an entirely different direction. Tofu didn't conquer China because it tasted extraordinary. It conquered China because millions of people were suddenly forbidden to eat meat. Buddhism. Buddhism arrived in China around the 1st century AD. It brought new philosophy, new rituals, and one very specific rule. Don't kill. Buddhist monks weren't supposed to eat meat. Ever. Which sounds simple until you try to feed thousands of monks across thousands of monasteries in a country where the main protein source was animals. The monks needed a solution. Tofu was the solution. By the Tang Dynasty, that's the 600s and 700s AD, Buddhist temples across China were producing tofu at scale. They perfected the process. They developed varieties we still eat today. Soft tofu, firm tofu, fried tofu, fermented tofu. Picture a mountain monastery in the year 700. Snow on the peaks, hundreds of monks. Travelers arriving cold and starving, welcomed at the gate. The kitchen has almost no meat. But it has a room lined with wooden presses. And every morning before dawn, tofu is being made for the day's meals. That kitchen kept people alive. Locals, pilgrims, refugees fleeing war. Tofu wasn't just food. It was survival with a philosophy attached. And the monks did something the alchemists never did. They wrote it down. They shared recipes. They taught the process to lay people who came to the temples. They turned tofu from a peasant food into something almost sacred. A food of purity, discipline, and mindfulness. That reputation would matter more than anyone realized. Now, one invention finally pushed tofu out of monastery kitchens and onto city streets. The rotary grindstone. Before the Han Dynasty, grinding beans meant crushing them by hand. Small batches. Exhausting labor. The rotary grindstone let one person process massive quantities in a fraction of the time. Suddenly, tofu wasn't rare. It was food you could sell from a cart in a marketplace. By the Song Dynasty, around 1,000 years ago, the scholar Zhu Xi wrote a poem called Song of Bean Curd. He praised tofu as one of the great foods of the common people. For a long time after that, tofu stayed inside China. Not because anyone was hiding it, because recipes traveled only as fast as merchants, monks, and ships could carry them. Then, in the 8th century, someone was willing to make that journey. Even if it killed him. His name was Ganjin. He was a Chinese Buddhist master, famous, revered. And in the 740s, Japanese envoys arrived at his temple with a request. Would he cross the sea? Would he come to Japan and teach them proper Buddhist ordination? Ganjin said yes. He would carry his knowledge east. The philosophy. The rituals. The recipes of the temple kitchens, including, according to many historians, the recipe for tofu. He tried once. The voyage failed. He tried again. That one failed too. The East China Sea, in the 8th century, was one of the deadliest passages on Earth. Ships were small. Navigation was primitive. Storms could last for days. Between Ganjin's first attempt and his last, he lost followers to shipwreck, to disease, to exhaustion. Dozens of people died trying to make the crossing beside him. He was betrayed. He was arrested. On one voyage, his ship was blown so far off course it landed in what is now Vietnam. He walked back to China. Somewhere in those years, the exact when isn't clear, Ganjin lost his sight. Some accounts blame a fever. Others blame the strain of endless travel. Either way, he went blind before his mission was complete. He was 66 years old. He tried a fifth time. That voyage succeeded. In 754 AD, an old blind Chinese monk finally stood on a beach in Japan. He couldn't see the land he had crossed the sea to reach, but he could hear it. He could feel it under his feet. He set up his teachings in the city of Nara. He founded a temple. Tosho Daiji still stands today over 1,000 years later, and with him, quietly, came the knowledge of foods that Japanese monks had only heard rumors of. Tofu was one of them. Ganjin wasn't the only person to carry tofu across the sea. Other envoys did too, but he's the human face of that transmission, and he's a reminder that culinary history isn't clean. It moves with people who suffer for it. For centuries after Ganjin, tofu remained inside Japanese Buddhist monasteries. Quietly, almost as a religious secret. The oldest surviving mention of tofu in Japan comes from the year 1183, an inscription at Kasuga Shrine in Nara. It appears on an offering list. Tofu, given to the gods. The first written proof of tofu in Japan isn't a recipe. It's a sacred offering. That reputation stuck. Tofu became the centerpiece of Shojin Ryori, Japanese Buddhist temple cuisine. Refined, almost ceremonial, food for monks, for aristocrats, for anyone wealthy enough to afford something so pure. Common people didn't eat it. Most of them had never even seen it. Then something strange happened. The samurai discovered it. For warriors trained to kill on command, temple food carried an unusual pull. Discipline, restraint, a meal that killed nothing. Some scholars think the appeal was spiritual, others think it was practical. Tofu was portable, nourishing, and cheap enough to feed an army. Whatever the reason, tofu became the food of both the monk and the warrior, two of the most powerful classes in Japan. Where those classes went, culture followed. But tofu still wasn't a food of ordinary people. That took a book. In 1782, an Osaka publisher released a cookbook called Tofu Hyakuchin, 100 tofu delicacies. It listed exactly what the title promised, 100 different ways to prepare tofu. Boiled, grilled, fried, simmered, chilled, stuffed, sweetened, smoked. The first edition sold out. Then it sold out again. A sequel came, then another. It became one of the biggest cookbooks in Japanese history. For the first time, a normal family in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, could open a book and learn how to cook tofu 100 different ways. Tofu shops opened on street corners. Vendors pushed carts through neighborhoods every morning, calling out prices. In just a few generations, tofu had gone from a sacred food of monks to a daily ingredient of the masses. Meanwhile, across the sea, a similar transformation was happening, with an unexpected twist. Tofu had already arrived in Korea, most likely during the Goryeo period. That's 918 to 1392. Buddhist monks brought it, the same way they'd brought it to Japan. Koreans called it dubu, and they didn't just adopt it, they perfected it. There are records, verified in Korean royal documents, of Korean tofu being so highly regarded that Chinese emperors specifically requested it. Chinese imperial banquets, according to those documents, imported dubu from Korea. Think about that. The student had become the master. The empire that invented tofu was now importing it from the country that had learned from it. Then tofu spread south. In Vietnam, it became dao hu, sold hot on street corners for breakfast, drizzled with ginger syrup. In Indonesia, it became tahu, deep-fried, stuffed with vegetables, sold from carts. In the Philippines, it became taho, a sweet breakfast dessert layered with brown sugar and tapioca pearls. In Myanmar, cooks did something remarkable. They made tofu from chickpeas instead of soybeans. Same coagulation principle. Completely different bean. Every country tofu reached, it adapted. Every culture made it their own. By the year 1600, tofu was a daily food across much of East and Southeast Asia. It fed monks in Kyoto, fishermen in Manila, rice farmers in the Mekong, merchants in Seoul. And yet, at that same moment in history, Europeans had almost no idea it existed. Nobody in Paris had heard of it. Nobody in London, nobody in Madrid. That was about to change, because in 1665, a Spanish priest was going to write down something he'd witnessed in China. Something so strange, so alien to European eyes that it would take another 105 years before an American, one of the most famous Americans who ever lived, would finally get his hands on the recipe. And there's a twist most people don't know. The first American to write about tofu may have died without ever tasting it. His name was Benjamin Franklin. The story begins in Manila. The year is 665. A Dominican friar named Domingo Fernandez de Navarrete has just returned from years of missionary work in China. He's writing a book about everything he saw, everything he ate, everything the Chinese did that seemed impossibly strange to European eyes. And in that book, he describes, in careful detail, a Chinese food he calls tofu. He explains how it's made. He notes that people of every class eat it, from the emperor down to the poorest farmer. He writes that it's universal in China. His book was published in Spanish in 1676. That is the very first known Western description of tofu. For nearly a century, that description sat almost forgotten in European libraries. Then a curious man picked it up. Benjamin Franklin. Most Americans know Franklin as a founding father, a signer of the Declaration, an inventor, the face on the $100 bill. Fewer people know he was one of the most obsessive eaters in early American history. Franklin was a part-time vegetarian. He read constantly about foreign foods. He wrote to farmers and botanists across 3 continents, always asking about new crops. In January 1770, Franklin was in London on diplomatic business. He came across Navarrete's account of tofu. He became fascinated. He wanted the recipe, so he did what Franklin always did. He asked. He tracked down a Scottish trader in London who had lived in China for years. The trader wrote back with a step-by-step description of how the Chinese turned soybeans into tofu. Franklin then packaged everything up, the description, the recipe, and a handful of actual soybeans, and mailed it across the Atlantic to his old friend John Bartram, the most famous botanist in Philadelphia. The date on Franklin's letter was January 11th, 1770. That letter is the first known American document to mention tofu. Franklin called it tofu. Now here's the honest part. Franklin probably never made tofu. Bartram probably never grew the soybeans successfully. The whole introduction happened on paper, a founding father sending seeds across an ocean, hoping something new might grow. Nothing did, not right away. For over a century after Franklin's letter, tofu was invisible in mainstream America. It didn't appear in cookbooks, it didn't appear on menus. But it did arrive. Just not the way Franklin imagined. It came with the men. Starting in 1849, Chinese immigrants arrived on the West Coast in massive numbers. They came for the gold rush. They stayed to build railroads. They worked in mines that killed them. They faced laws that barred them from owning land, from marrying, from bringing their families to join them. And in the neighborhoods they built to survive, the Chinatowns of San Francisco, Sacramento, Portland, they made tofu. Small shops, wooden vats, hand-cranked grindstones. Tofu made before dawn, sold before noon, gone by evening. Those shops kept the craft alive in America for 4 generations, while mainstream America ignored it, while newspapers mocked Chinese food, while immigration laws tried to erase the community that made it. The tofu makers just kept working. They passed the recipes to sons, to nephews, to apprentices. And when America finally became curious about tofu in the 1970s, the knowledge was already here, waiting. It had been here the whole time. It just wasn't visible to the country that had forgotten to look. Meanwhile, something strange was happening on American farms. Between 1900 and 1940, the United States quietly became one of the largest soybean growers on Earth. Not because Americans wanted to eat soybeans, because soybeans made excellent animal feed and excellent industrial oil. Henry Ford was obsessed with the crop. He had a suit made partly from soy fiber. He served soybean-based meals at company banquets. He believed soybeans were the industrial future. By the 1930s, America was growing mountains of soy. Henry Ford was even wearing it, yet almost no Americans were eating tofu. The reaction that could turn those beans into a food had been sitting in Chinatowns for 100 years. Nobody outside those communities cared. That was about to change, because in the 1960s, a 27-year-old American man was standing in the kitchen of a Zen monastery. He was about to taste something that would ruin every plan he had. His name was Bill Shirtliff. Shurtleff was searching for meaning. He'd graduated from Stanford. He'd joined the Peace Corps. He'd spent time teaching in Nigeria. By 1970, he was studying under the Japanese Zen master Shunryu Suzuki at Tasajara Zen Mountain Center in California. At Tasajara, meals were mostly vegetarian, and a staple was tofu. For Shurtleff, it was a revelation. The tofu at Tasajara wasn't the bland, watery block Americans imagined. It was fresh, handmade, custardy. It tasted of the beans it came from. He asked how it was made. He asked where the recipe came from. He asked why nobody in America had written about it in English. The answers were dead ends. There was no serious book on tofu available to Western readers. Not one. In a country producing millions of tons of soybeans a year, there wasn't a single accessible guide to the food that most of Asia ate every day. Shurtleff decided to fix that. In October 1972, he moved to Japan. And he wasn't alone. He met a young Japanese woman named Akiko Aoyagi. She was born in Tokyo in 1950. She was an artist, a designer, and a brilliant cook. She spoke Japanese natively, something Shurtleff couldn't do. This matters, because everything they were about to attempt depended on it. They needed access to tofu makers who had spent generations guarding their techniques. They needed to enter tiny family shops where the owner would refuse to explain anything to a foreign man alone. They needed to translate not just words, but meaning. Why one master used gypsum and another used nagari. Why the texture in Kyoto was different from the texture in Osaka. Akiko unlocked those doors. She interviewed the tofu masters. She sketched their equipment by hand. She wrote out the recipes. She caught details that Bill, working from English notes and hand signals, would have missed entirely. Bill gathered the history. Akiko made it understandable. Her drawings turned unfamiliar machinery and centuries-old techniques into instructions an American reader could actually follow. They lived in a tiny apartment. They had almost no money. They worked 6 days a week, waking before dawn to reach shops that started at 4 a.m. And they hit obstacles constantly. Some tofu makers refused to let them photograph anything. Some let them in and then quietly withheld the crucial steps. There was no template for what they were doing. No publisher waiting, no advance, no funding. They were living on savings. When the savings ran out, they lived on almost nothing. There were long stretches where they wondered if the book would ever exist. If anyone in America would ever read it. If they'd wasted years of their lives documenting a food most Americans considered inedible. They kept going anyway. For 6 years. In 1975, they finally published the Book of Tofu, 336 pages. History, science, culture, over 250 recipes, hundreds of Akiko's illustrations. The first edition printed 5,000 copies. They sold out in 1 month. The publisher scrambled. Ballantine Books, a major New York publisher, picked up the mass market rights. They printed 10,000 more the next year, then more, then more. Over the following years, the Book of Tofu would sell more than 600,000 copies. For a cookbook about a food most Americans had never heard of, written by 2 unknown authors, that number was impossible. And Bill and Akiko didn't stop there. They toured America, they taught workshops, they helped people open small tofu shops, they connected suppliers, they co-founded what became the Soy Foods Association of North America in 1976. Within a few years, dozens of American tofu companies were operating. Massachusetts, New York, California, Oregon. A food that had been invisible in mainstream America for 200 years was suddenly on natural food shelves from Boston to San Diego. Tofu had gone global. But here's the twist that almost nobody talks about. The book created demand almost overnight. But the tofu Americans actually found in stores was so bad it nearly destroyed the young industry. Most of the new tofu makers were passionate, but inexperienced. They didn't have the equipment for consistent quality. Supermarkets refrigerated it wrong. Grocery clerks didn't rotate stock. Chefs had no training in how to cook it. Consumers bought it, took it home, boiled it plain, and tasted something that reminded them of wet cardboard. They swore they'd never eat it again. Tofu became a punchline. Comedians made fun of it. Movies used it as shorthand for tasteless, joyless health food. The word tofu became slang for anything overly virtuous and underflavored. There's something painful in that. Because in Kyoto, Master tofu makers had spent centuries perfecting texture. In Chinese monasteries, monks had refined the craft for over 1,000 years. In San Francisco's Chinatown, immigrant families had been making beautiful tofu since before the Civil War. The food itself had never been a joke. The joke was that the country making fun of it didn't understand what it was tasting. The reputation nearly killed the industry Bill and Akiko had built. But something else was happening underneath. Researchers had begun studying soy proteins seriously. They were looking at populations that ate tofu daily, Japan, Korea, parts of China, and asking whether the food was doing something specific to the body. The results were debated. The methodology was argued over. But the attention helped reposition tofu, from fringe health food to serious meat alternative. Then came the vegetarian movement, then the environmental movement, then the animal rights movement. Every one of them turned to tofu. By the 2000s, tofu wasn't a punchline anymore. It was a category: silken, firm, extra firm, smoked, baked, marinated, sprouted. Michelin-starred chefs began serving tofu tasting menus. Cookbook authors devoted entire books to it. Grocery stores that had never carried it in the 1990s stocked 8 varieties by 2015. And during the pandemic of 2020, when millions of Americans rediscovered home cooking, American tofu sales spiked to their highest levels in history. 2,000 years after the alchemists on Bagong Mountain, tofu wasn't just alive in America, it was thriving. The prince who tried to become a god by accident. The blind monk who crossed a killer sea. The Spanish priest who described it in wonder, the founding father who begged for the recipe, the immigrant families who kept the craft alive when no one else would, the Zen student and the artist from Tokyo who wrote the book that finally cracked America open. Every single one of them contributed to a single unbroken chain, a chain that runs from a mountain in Han Dynasty China all the way to the block of tofu sitting in your refrigerator right now. That chain has never been broken. Not once. Not for 2,000 years. Think about how rare that is. Most foods have been transformed almost beyond recognition. Modern wheat looks nothing like ancient wheat. Modern apples are hundreds of generations of grafting away from what humans ate 5,000 years ago. Modern corn dwarfs the wild grass Aztec farmers first domesticated. Almost every crop humans eat has been reshaped. Tofu is different. The equipment changed, the scale changed, the varieties multiplied, refrigeration transformed how it's stored, packaging transformed how it's sold, but the basic chemistry remained remarkably familiar. Grind soybeans, boil the slurry, strain the milk, add a coagulant, press the curds, drain the water. That's it. Same 5 basic steps, same chemistry, same food. A tofu maker from 200 BC would be stunned by the machinery. But once someone explained what the machines were doing, she'd nod. She'd recognize every stage. Because the reaction happening inside the curds is exactly the reaction her hands used to trigger. Everything about tofu's world changed. The reaction didn't. Today, tofu is eaten in almost every country on Earth. There are over 200 varieties in Japan alone. In parts of China, stinky tofu is fermented in brines so pungent they can clear a street. In Korea, sundubu jjigae uses tofu so soft it barely holds its shape. In American cities, tofu shows up in tacos, in smoothies, in vegan cheesecakes. None of it would exist without the people who carried the craft this far. Liu An died in 122 BC. According to the historical record, he was accused of plotting against the emperor and took his own life. He never got the immortality he chased. He didn't get another day. But the accident attributed to his mountain? That accident is still here. Every time someone slices a block of tofu, anywhere in the world, in any kitchen, in any language, they're repeating a process that traces back to that one mountain in that one province over 2,000 years ago. The prince spent his fortune chasing eternal life. He didn't find it. But if there's such a thing as an accidental immortality, a small, quiet kind made of soybeans and mineral salt and the patience of people who refuse to let a good idea die, then Liu An got it anyway. He didn't live forever, but his accident did. That block on the board was born of a failed experiment. It survived the fall of the Han Dynasty. It survived Mongol invasions. It survived the closing of Japan. It survived European colonialism, world wars, pandemics, and its own long century of being misunderstood. It survived being mocked, mistranslated, and mistreated in a dozen languages. And it's still here. Not many foods can claim a story like that. Because a good idea, a simple, honest, useful idea, is almost impossible to kill. You just need someone, somewhere, willing to keep the tradition going. For 2,000 years, that's exactly what happened. Alchemists, monks, warriors, priests, founding fathers, immigrants, artists, a blind old man on a boat in a storm, not one of them knew they were part of the chain. Every one of them kept it alive. The next time you're at a grocery store and you walk past the refrigerated case where the tofu sits, quiet, unremarkable, next to the yogurt, remember what you're looking at. Not just food. A survivor, 2,000 years old, almost unchanged, made by people whose names you'll never know, sold in a plastic tub for a few dollars, carrying a history longer than most countries have existed. That's tofu. And now you know how it got there. If you want another story of a food that survived 2,000 years and quietly changed the world, watch our history of soy sauce next. There's a moment in it that connects directly to something you just heard. And if you want more long-form documentaries like this, real research, real history, real stories about the things that shaped human civilization, subscribe. That's how you'll catch the next one. Thanks for spending 38 minutes with us. We'll see you on the mountain.